Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is worth remembering amidst the collection of yarns, half-truths, downright fallacies, general exceptionalism, etc., that passes for military history in Australia and also in the broader field of the First World War, that Australia's gunners on the Western Front between 1916 and 1918 were imitators rather than innovators. Artillery in Australia at the time was a rudimentary, although modernising arm, and Australia's fledgling military forces when the war broke out. And at Gallipoli, the constraints of terrain, a lack of guns, a lack of ammunition, prevented the full potential of Australia's artillery being realised. Arriving in France to join a war of unprecedented scale, lacking in experience, and with a relatively minor capability compared to that possessed by the British Expeditionary Force, the artillery of the Australian Imperial Force had no option but to accept the practices and structures of the British Expeditionary Force, and they had to do so quickly. My task this evening is to examine the state of the BEF's artillery and the trends occurring in its development at the point that it was joined on the Western Front by the divisions of the AIF and their field brigades in early 1916. And this period coincided with the preparations for the Somme offensive that would be launched on the 1st of July. This paper, along with those which follow about the organisation of the AIF's artillery following Gallipoli, thus serve as a precursor to more detailed considerations of the AIF's artillery's own role in 1916, which will form the subject of the next seminar. Now, I was given the theme tonight of innovation or folly, but I prefer not to set my analysis in such binary terms. I'd rather like to characterise what follows as grappling for a solution. What I will demonstrate is that the experience of 1915 led to a range of changes in the BEF's artillery and its practices, some which laid the intellectual and technical foundations for the successes of 1918, while others, which in retrospect may seem like folly. However, most of these should be seen as genuine efforts to innovate. And I'll look at three themes: structure and organisation, command and control, and tactics and doctrine. Now, prior to the Somme offensive being launched in July, in 1916, that the BF's artillery was going through a process of standardisation and reorganisation. That the critical crises in guns and in shells, which had marred its operations in 1915, had largely passed. And we can see that reflected in the number of guns that the BF is able to field. In July of 1915, it has just over 1,500 artillery pieces of all calibres deployed in France. By January of 1916, it has 2,700, and by July of 1916, when the Somme offensive begins, it has just a little over 5,000 artillery pieces fielded. Now, the guiding principles of this reorganisation, of this standardisation, were simplicity and uniformity. In the dark days of 1915, pressing new guns into the field, all sorts of old rubbish were brought across from Britain and brought across actually from other places in the Empire and put into the field just to get guns on the ground. And there was also a wide plethora of organisations amongst the different British formations, and this reorganisation was about bringing about increased efficiency and removing the complications to logistical support. This reorganisation was based on a three-tiered structure defined by the mobility and capabilities of a standardised set of guns. Now, the first of these three tiers was the divisional artillery. These were light, relatively mobile guns with a limited range. And we're talking there with a reach out to about 6.5 kilometres. Divisional field artillery was the 18-pounders, 4.5-inch howitzers, and they were permanently allotted and moved with their parent formation. Second tier was the corps artillery. They were heavy guns. By heavy guns, we're talking about guns at the time with a calibre of 6 inches or larger, and in modern terminology, that works out at a little bit under 155 millimetres. Now, these were heavier guns, obviously, but they were still able to be moved relatively easily and thus be able to follow advancing advancing infantry formations. And then finally there was the army artillery. They were the most powerful, longest ranging guns, described as heavies, super heavies, and guns so big that they need to go on railway carriages. And we're talking there of a range out to about 20 kilometres. So by modern standards, these are still not particularly long-ranging guns for the weight of shell that they're throwing. And as a reserve artillery officer, this is my thing these days, so it's also worth mentioning that mortars had been adopted principally as a response to trench warfare originally, to be able to get things out of one trench and into the next. But during 1915, they were also a stopgap for the shortage of artillery. That a mortar was a relatively simple piece of ordnance, they could be manufactured quickly and cheaply, and there was a proliferation of all manner of weird and wacky and sometimes quite dangerous designs fielded in France during 1915. In early 1916, these were also incorporated into the standardised divisional artillery the standardised organisations within the divisional artillery. And so you ended up with a heavy mortar battery with one 9.45 inch heavy mortar, 3 medium mortar batteries within the division, each with 4, at that point in time, 2-inch mortars, which you can see there. 2 inches the calibre of the spigot rather than the bomb. It was known as a plum pudding bomb because it threw that thing out into no man's land. And the infantry brigades each had two batteries of 3-inch Stokes mortars, which were later amalgamated into a single 8-mortar battery. So you can see here already, even in early 1916, that the BEF is starting to develop a layered concept of fire support. That one of the other things that the mortars provided was relieving artillery from the very close range work in no man's land and into the enemy's forward trenches to enable the guns to be used to fight a deeper battle beyond. Now, following on from this standardisation of equipment and organisations, there was also a significant trend in early 1916 to increasing centralisation of command and control. That you had increasing numbers of guns being put into the field, that you had a need to coordinate across divisional fronts and even across corps fronts. So prior to October of 1915, the only artillery commander in the BEF was at divisional level. He commanded his divisional artillery, and the artillery officers at corps and at army level were merely advisors. And obviously, as an advisor, you command nothing, and nobody has to listen to you if they don't want to. So given the increasing numbers of guns being fielded, these larger organisations, in October of 1915, a commander of the artillery is established at corps level with a small staff. Subsequently, there's also a commander of heavy artillery established at corps level, reflecting the large numbers of heavy guns arriving in France. And for a while, the command relationship between them is very confused. It is subsequently sorted out, which puts the commander heavy artillery subordinate to the commander of the corps artillery. But the staffs that these artillery commanders have are very small. That you have both corps and divisional level artillery commanders only have a staff of 2 officers at this point in 1916. The artillery also has a subordinate role in planning at this point. As the work of Sanders Marble and Andy Simpson has discussed, artillery officers had subordinate roles in planning at division and at division level and above. You often had senior artillery officers left out. They were sometimes consulted, they were sometimes not, they were sometimes invited to planning meetings, they were sometimes left behind. Decisions about targets, about effects, about the duration of bombardments were often made without reference to the artillery officers who were to carry them out. Often they were given tasks and sent away to accomplish it, whether they were realistic or not. The principal decisions about artillery on the first day of the Somme were made by General Haig, the British Commander-in-Chief in France, and General Rawlinson, the commander of the 4th Army, who was carrying out the assault. We will look at some of the faults with that planning later, that the Chief Artillery Officer at GHQ, General Birch, by that point in time, had some serious concerns about the density of the fire being used. But again, the internal culture of the BF at that point in time meant that you argued these things behind closed doors, and then once the decision was made, you shut up and got on with it. But we have to be careful here that we don't associate too much centralisation of control in the artillery at this point in 1916. That these efforts were being made towards greater centralisation, towards giving officers at corps level and then eventually army level command authority. But particularly down within the corps and at the divisions, there was still a wide variety of approaches. And the question that raises, of course, is that centralised control was desirable, particularly when artillery needed to be pre-programmed, that they were seeking a centralised doctrine so that lessons from the field could be institutionalised. But at the same thing, as we will see during the Battle of the Somme, this degree of variation down at divisional level was where the artillery's innovation really germinated. Now, another component of the standardisation agenda was the promulgation of a common doctrine. Prior to 1916, there was essentially one artillery PAM for the field artillery. There was a couple for technical standards for the Royal Garrison Artillery manning the heavy guns. But in May of 1916, the first doctrine produced for the First World War was released, which was Artillery in Offensive Operations. And it was released in May of 1916 based on an interpretation of the experience of 1915. And I say the interpretation because this is where some of the potential folly of what we see as the folly of the Somme offensive starts to creep in. At the Battle of Neuve-Chapelle in March of 1915, it had been demonstrated that infantry, well-supported artillery, could break into a heavily defended German position. There was a short bombardment during that attack. There'd been no prior registration, and the infantry broke in, secured the German front line, but then the attack floundered. What had happened was that there was no real treatment of the German positions in depth, and so when they sought to move beyond the first line, they couldn't do so. Now, at the time, this was associated with, well, the German defences hadn't been appropriately destroyed, so what was needed was more firepower. What had actually probably happened was the intensity of this barrage, combined with the surprise, had neutralised the Germans, allowing the infantry to close successfully the frontline trenches. So there you had a lesson being learned being observed potentially in 1915 that really wasn't properly learned until the end of 1917, moving on to 1918. Now, this interpretation was seemingly confirmed at the Battle of Loos in September of 1915. The front there was 8 times longer. The artillery employed there was about the same number as had been used at Neuve-Chapelle. And because there was going to be less density of shells on the ground, it was determined that the barrage would go on for longer. Now, what this meant that the barrage went on for 4 days, it squandered surprise, the Germans were ready, the attack failed. But the interpretation from the BF's headquarters was that what was needed was more firepower, longer preparation. So when Artillery in Offensive Operations was released in May of 1916, it's very heavily, it's founded on this concept of destruction. And I quote it here, "The preliminary bombardment is designed to achieve a certain purpose, namely to enable the infantry to enter and penetrate the enemy's position. For this, his works and obstacles protecting them must be adequately destroyed and his morale shaken." Now, the quest for this adequate destruction rested on the search for a formula based on the number of guns per yard of attack frontage. Now, during the planning for the Somme offensive, General Headquarters sought advice from its subordinate formations about what that distribution of guns should be. And the factors for the preliminary bombardment was also, the time for the preliminary bombardment, was also determined by calculations which were made about how long it would take to destroy the wire entanglements in front of the German positions. So this shows us that there was ongoing study, deliberation, attempts to learn from experience going on in the BF. This is an army trying to learn from its experiences. Its faults lay not necessarily in a lack of innovation, but perhaps with the assumptions on which it was based. Despite the emphasis on destruction, there was still a realisation that the Germans would continue to fight once the infantry closed with their position. So the other key component of defensive doctrine which was developed at this time was the barrage. State of the art in barrage thinking at this point in time was the lifting barrage that was designed to fall initially on a German trench and then as the infantry closed, lift to their second and third line. So designed to deal with German depth. The lifts were programmed according to a pre-programmed schedule. Now, these tactics were heavily dependent on the concentration of guns and the stockpiling of ammunition. Now, there wasn't, as I talked about before, the shortages of 1915, but these were not in copious supplies either. To prepare for the Somme offensive, other parts of the front had to be denuded, which had dire consequences, for instance, for the attack at Fromelles in mid-July. There's not the scope to recount the first day of the subsequent campaign in detail, but allow me to offer some observations about why all this artillery failed to achieve the intended results. The inability of the preliminary barrage to destroy German resistance was once again demonstrated. But the German positions were heavily fortified. The accuracy of the British guns was dubious, and particularly at the time you had a lot of new artillery personnel, particularly from the new army formations, in the field for the first time, technical skills quite low, and they didn't really have the abilities, for instance, to adjust to the provision of non-standard ammunition. This leads us also to the problems with the ammunition, that the problem now was not with the quantity of the ammunition, but with the quality. During the Somme offensive, 30% or so of shells were duds. Also, the destructive potential of the guns did not relate to the number of guns per yard of front attacked, but rather the number of shells per yard of trench. Rawlinson had intended a shallow penetration to grab a chunk of the German line, consolidate and then move on, which would have ensured a high density of shells on his targets, whereas Haig subsequently expanded the objectives of the attack, which meant a deep penetration and dispersed the density of the artillery employed. There was also no common approach to infantry cooperation with the barrage. Practice was uneven, that many of the commanders employed large safety distances. You could advance behind a shrapnel shell at about 50 yards behind it. In some cases, infantry was still in their trenches when the barrage lifted, and what this meant, of course, was that the Germans were able to man their parapet before the infantry got there. This also leads us on to one of the chief weaknesses of the lifting barrage. If it lifted before the infantry closed with the enemy, they could man their parapet, man their machine guns and engage the attacking infantry. Fire could also lift over intermediate positions between the main trench lines, which increasingly the Germans occupied and only lightly held the trenches. And once the barrage was lost, there was very little that could be done to get it back. Now, the focus on the destruction of enemy defences also sucked in resources. Counter-battery fire was only the third priority for most British corps prior to the 1st of July, and German artillery, although not a major problem on the 1st of July, became increasingly ferocious in its response to subsequent British actions in the days and months that followed. I've gone over my time here, so I will leave discussing the legacy of the Somme until the plenary session. Thank you very much.